Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining. I know there's a lot of temptations outdoors, so beautiful day. And so thank you for joining us. We have a very special guest today. We are honored to have with us Julie Gehrki, president of the Walmart Foundation. In more than 15 years at the company, Gehrki has shaped transformative strategic giving programs at the Walmart Foundation and served as a trusted advisor to the business on initiatives that created shared value for associates, customers, investors, and community. This is also a kind of homecoming for Julie, who attended our school's predecessor, the Center on Philanthropy, as what was then called a Jane Addams Fellow. And we have at least one other Jane Addams Fellow. Two Jane Addams Fellows in the audience. It was a brainchild of one of our founders, Bob Payton. In addition to her time at our school, Julie has a BA in Religious and Urban Studies from Rhodes College and a master's in Public Service from the University of Arkansas, Clinton School of Public Service. At the end of our discussion, we will have time for audience questions for both here in person and for our audience on Zoom. Please feel free to jot down your thoughts as we go along, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. Thank you for being with us so much.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to be back.
So I think everybody in this room has heard of Walmart or shopped at Walmart.
Not one I have to explain very often.
But it isn't. It's an enterprise of immense scale. The world's largest retailer, the largest private employer. What does a foundation connected to something as vast and as iconic as Walmart seek to accomplish?
Sure. This is part of what keeps me there.
Yeah.
To do philanthropy. So I think my role can only really be understood through the company. Because when corporate philanthropy is working well, it should feel like an extension of the company. And as you kind of alluded to, my role is unique. So I oversee both the foundation and the corporate philanthropy. But then I spend about half my time as a shared value consultant to my colleagues at the company. And that's really important because Walmart starts with the idea that the company in and of itself should be solving social and environmental problems through the business. And it is unabashedly a long-term capitalism company. So it thinks long-term. We want to deliver quarterly results, but we believe that, over time, our economic interest will intersect with social and environmental problems. And so it is in their best interest, and they actually believe can be a business strategy that creates business value through solving social and environmental problems. That creates a context in which the philanthropy is not this side project, but an essential tool in fulfilling the company's mission. And so the issues we work on are really have to stay really relevant to the company. And you're thinking of things like sustainable supply chains. How do we make supply chains good for people and planet? How do we do that through the purchase order and the things that Walmart does? But inevitably, there are things that the market can't solve that are kind of beyond a purchase order's capability because of missing capacity or market failure or something of that nature. And that's where our philanthropy can play a really big role. And so it means all of our philanthropy is, shaped that way and is on these issues. So we think of kind of three big areas where we work. The first is economic mobility. We are the world's largest private employer. We have a huge number of frontline jobs that have limited barriers to entry. How do we make those skill building jobs? And then how do we make skills be a currency that leads to mobility? So we work with people like here locally, we were talking earlier with Lumina Foundation and others on making sure skills-based pathways are really viable ways to grow. And the business does that, but we fund against it too. We talked about sustainable supply chains around the world for social and environmental causes. So issues like deforestation, preservation of nature, both in commodities and human rights issues in areas that Walmart would source from, because that means I can go across to the beef buyer and understand why we don't have transparency into beef that's coming from a certain place and what he would need to make a different choice. And those kinds of things so that I understand the system in a different way. And then the third piece is community resilience. We're in a little over 11,000 communities around the world, 5,000 in the US, about 6,000 locations outside the US. And so how do we become a part of a thriving local economy? How do we make sure that they're resilient to shocks, whether that's hunger, disaster? If we're in there, if we're part of that community, it means our supply chain reaches there, we're getting products there, we have cold chain. All of these things can be part of solving problems. So to do philanthropy is to think of money as one of several tools you're using to try to make systems change.
So philanthropy is really a partner to the business in a very integrated way, as you were talking about that. But what still strikes me is the scale. You guys are bigger than anybody else. So what is it? Is there something about the scale that allows you to do differently or forces you to do things differently? Because I can imagine other companies also wanting to, use some of these tools as well. But the scale would just be different. Does that feed into your difference?
It does. I mean, but I would also say, like, one of the first lessons you always learn at Walmart is, like, no matter the scale, you need partners and systems change. And you can't change a system as a single actor, no matter how large or size. And so we think, I'll give, just to kind of ground us in the scale of the philanthropy, our cash in kind giving last year was just over $2 billion. The easiest kind of first scale lesson I joined the company in 2008. So early 2008, the recession started. And suddenly the food bank system in the US was not where it needed to be. It was suddenly serving many, many more people. Food banks thought they needed to go buy bigger buildings and these kinds of things. And we said, like, wait a minute, we have assets and resources here. And we deployed logistics experts to go help them get double the throughput of the food bank, to cold chain, but also started really looking at our food donation program and saying, what would it mean for us to put real emphasis behind a cold chain so that the retail pickup program that was in its infancy at that point to pick up retail food that wasn't selling, but not just the shelf stable goods, but the fresh. So we ended up buying things like 300 refrigerated trucks for food banks around the country. Today, last year alone in the US, we donated 750 million pounds of food to food banks. We're a larger donor than the federal government. All of these pieces are scale, and you have to do it at each store. So yes, that gets scale, but you've got to be thinking at the micro and the macro constantly, because that is every fresh produce manager in the company understanding food safety, how you cull the meat and dairy and fresh. About 70% of what we donate these days is meat, dairy, and fresh. So it's fruits, vegetables that we're getting into food banks. But getting it right at the micro allows you to get the scale.
So it has to be replicable in a vast variety of sites.
And I think the converse of the advantage of scale is the risk of it. The biggest challenge of my job is probably opportunity cost. There are thousands of things we could do. When I first started, we were kind of in this phase of thinking about what we should stand for. They were really trying to reinvent the philanthropy at Walmart. And my job was to take all these meetings with smart people who work on issues and listen. And literally, I probably took 45 meetings where they started with, y'all are the largest seller of X, therefore you should, of bikes, of diabetic test supplies, of, and you get to the place where you have to flip it and say, but what's large for us? Because any time or resource I spend on what gives us the less leverage is potentially wasted energy that could have higher value. And that's really hard, that discipline.
So trying to use all of your resources comprehensively rather than focusing on one area where you're not using the rest of your resources. So you've already given us a sense of the ethos of the company as being kind of focused on, kind of built in this notion of social change and improving society around it. Tell us a little bit more about that,
Sure.
Because where did that come from, and how do we see that maybe reflected in our experiences as consumers?
And I will, as I tell this, I'm cognizant, this will sound like she's had multiple servings of the Kool-Aid. I get it. It is a deeply purpose-driven company. And I was really surprised to find that when I joined. It's not what I had the impression of. I frankly went kicking and screaming into corporate philanthropy. I had no interest. I kind of thought corporate philanthropy was a marketing extension, and that just wasn't what I was interested in. But I joined at a time the CEO 2 years before had given what's called the 21st Century Leadership Speech that outlined, I mean, this was 2006, it was right past Katrina. It outlined sustainability goals before companies were doing it. And what that was built on is a couple of things. So first, the company takes very seriously that it was founded by Sam Walton to solve access to affordable goods for people in rural America and small towns. That Sam Walton saw a business opportunity that small towns were not being served well by retail. You had to go drive to Kansas City to get a low price on something, or you had to pay more in your local, and he felt like he could solve that. And that was the business plan. And so it was in many ways shared value before shared value was a term, was I can solve a problem for the community with a business model and make money on it. Company did that, and that was kind of the core for a long time. It grew really fast in the 90s. Growth was limited, probably, and some of that was reputational, fast growth, the number of problems, things that it could do better. And so in kind of 2005, the CEO, Lee Scott, started doing a big listening tour with critics, and spent a lot of time with environmental organizations, with social organizations, just anybody who kind of wanted him to think differently about the company. In the midst of this, Hurricane Katrina happens. And Walmart sees that it could do something, and the kind of edict goes, do the right thing. If you go to New Orleans and say Walmart today, still people are like, thank you for what you did in Katrina. The federal government had kind of a weak response in that moment. And we were able to get trucks and supplies into the city, open stores, open pharmacies, all of these things for months before other things were open. This is a long-winded way of saying, these are the narratives that the company tells. The narrative after that was, how are we that company every day? And that wasn't like, hey, this team over here should be that team every day and everybody else get back to work on sales. It was, this is who we are. How do we show up that way? How are we relevant to consumers? How are we solving real problems for them? And so when you work in that kind of environment, the beef buyer doesn't see me as the nuisance who cares about deforestation. They see me as an extension of their job and somebody who understands issues and is going to help them solve problems. When you go to the head of HR and they're thinking about skills-based advancement and how they change their systems, she sees my team and I as resources. And we really do solve problems around a shared team.
So when we were talking, when we Zoomed some months ago, I had heard rumors and you confirmed them that the company also conducts its business in a very democratic way, right? People are kind of, you don't have a lot of hierarchy and a lot of frills. And so give us a sense of what that would be like. In a university, we kind of love to create hierarchies for no sure why.
I don't want to pretend there isn't hierarchy, that would be false. But it is a very accessible company. So, the CEO answers every email he gets every day. Every associate in the company has access to his email. You will hear from him. If I emailed him right now, I would probably hear from him in an hour.
How does that work when you have 100? How many is that?
He is an exceptional human being, and I don't understand it. But it is the principles of the company are good ideas come from everywhere. Insights, we all have different backgrounds, and the solutions often come from people really sitting around a table with different backgrounds and insights and kind of arguing it out or building on each other. And then, some of this also comes from, there's a phrase that is EDLC, everyday low cost. And this idea that the company needs to run very frugally so that we can deliver everyday low price for customers. So everyday low price means like a commitment that if you're buying we may not be the lowest on a single item, but if you're buying a basket of groceries, it should be significantly cheaper than our competitors. And we aren't gonna play high-low coupon games. It's gonna be like the price that we can deliver every day. And the only way you do that is running a very lean, cost-conscious company. So it means like I'm staying at Bottle Works and it's like the nicest hotel I ever stay in. I'm normally like the Holiday Inn Comfort Suites kind of hotel, but so is every leader, you know, and like the office is like our corporate office is about to change and they're actually very worried about the company culture staying the same. The corporate office is in an old logistics warehouse. Nobody has windows. It is, you know, it was built in the 60s. It is, the CEO's office still has wood paneling. Like it is not, and that creates a different ethos. That is very mission driven. You don't come there for the perks. You come there for the mission, you come there for the work. You come there for the culture, and there's a real sense of people wanting to deliver for customers. We have different philosophies about that, but.
And you have senior colleagues who came up from the very entry-level jobs, who didn't go through fancy schools and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. Our CEO started loading boxes. I mean, he did go and get an MBA in the process, but like he also he rear-ended his boss's car the first day. Like he's got a real but a huge portion of the senior team started as hourly retail associates with us or other places. And that the credibility, they have way more credibility than I could ever earn because they have worked in retail as an hourly associate. And that credibility is deeply valued in the company.
That gives, at least that gives me a picture of a very kind of a mission-oriented place. So as you're deploying your grant-making strategy, when you lead the foundation, what have been some of the kind of impactful projects that you like to point out as ones that we should pay attention to as successes?
Sure. And you asked a little bit to talk about something that might be happening in Indiana. So
yes, that would be great.
I am going to choose one that has some elements of it here. So we do think that college educations are really important, but people should be able to have economic mobility without college, and that a skills-based pathway needs to be a really viable way for people to grow and advance in our country. We can do that as a company in how we hire in advance, and we've built 200 academies that are next to stores where people go for training. Some of it's on the floor, some of it's in the academy. It's all on iPads, so you're getting digital skills. While you're doing that, we're certifying you. You get hours. We have, if you're an hourly associate, you can get a free college education or short-term credential that we'll hire against, and we'll pay for all of that. Like, those are things the business can do, and very loudly talk about this drives productivity and return so that our competitors copy it. And that's how the market can solve. But there are inevitably gaps in that. And we think that things like, I'll get really wonky here, learning and employment records that are digital records of your skills, that whether if you're in the military, they cross into, or you do volunteer work and gain skills. I lived abroad, nobody ever gives credit for people like understanding how to work cross-culturally. Like, we all have skills that are missing on our resumes. That is nowhere more true than somebody who didn't go to college. If you take a public transportation, you're problem solving and getting to work every day on time. There are all kinds of skills people are acquiring. How do we certify those? How do we digitally put them in place so that we can build on them? You know, a record, something I see every day is, we all know the cashier that people stand in line to wait for because she or he is amazing at customer service, and the one that people avoid. How are we giving the person who is amazing at it a certification that means the next level of customer service that is not maybe the same employer? So like the the cell phone company that needs customer service said, like, I'll invest in this person's skills because I see that Walmart certified them in customer service. We can teach them how to do a cell phone, and by the way, that pays $10,000 more a year or whatever. We need that kind of world. So in Indiana, we've invested in the Indiana Digital, got it written down, Ivy Tech and Purdue have an Indiana digital wallet of skills that's interoperable with a bunch of other organizations. We've made investments there. Last year, in total in Indiana, it was about $45 million of cash and in kind we invested locally. So stores are giving, food is flowing, but in addition, we've invested in some of the skills work that the state has really been leading. South Bend's been doing stuff that started as early as when Pete Buttigieg was mayor, that we invested into making a lifelong city. So we really are thinking about what it'll take to have a skills-based future. How do we change hiring managers' perceptions of skills versus degrees so we don't just block them out? There's a lot to be done.
And the digital wallet is something that you carry with yourself wherever you go.
Yeah, you can, it's like your Apple Wallet for payment, but it's got all your skills. Maybe like you should own your data about your skills.
Yeah, we still work with transcripts here, unfortunately.
Totally.
But I think.
And I might own library fines to get my transcript and.
But yeah, I think that's really interesting. So maybe you've already done that, but one of the things that we wrestle with in our classes here, and I'm sure you did too when you were here, was measuring the impact of some of these issues, which are often difficult to get at. So how do you measure success, and how do you show your colleagues that the investment from the company is worth it?
The first thing is, I would say, like, we take that really seriously, mainly because we really want to learn and do better. I actually have very little pressure from the company to prove results. It is much more a desire to make sure we're being a good investor and not creating undue harm, a number of things that philanthropy can do and needs to take seriously. We think about learning at different points. So there's learning in a single investment. And that's certainly important. And we do try to set a framework with our grantees where learning is an outcome and an impact, not just, because we're a systems change funder, we tend to not be somebody who wants you to count, because that's not really what we're doing. It's, each portfolio is a little bit different. We do tend to do much more measurement at a kind of portfolio grant level. So, I'll talk about sustainable supply chains. We have a commitment to preserve, protect, or restore or sustainably manage 50 million acres of land around the world that's tied to supply chain development. So yes, we're counting acres with people like World Wildlife Fund and others. But more than that, we're trying to build a viable model of sourcing where companies could source from certain places and know that things were produced in a way that is good for the environment, and just people, if they have been a part of this, have gotten ownership and parts of this. So and that is more of how are you going to create incentives for companies? Are companies starting to think this way? Are there good measurement systems in place that will be able to certify this? And so that is often conversations we have with researchers who are looking holistically at how the field is being shaped, at what would good GHG credits look like for this? And could they be certified and in a market? And starting to see more companies making nature commitments and recognizing nature as part of the supply chain, not just carbon emissions. And so that tends to be an influence of we're seeing more and more businesses make commitments to do this kind of work in their supply chain. It tends to be is the measurement systems of this world taking this into account and really having thoughtful, affordable, scalable ways to measure this, and is investment flowing to it? And then are we turning the tide on things like deforestation in a region of Brazil that we're worried about? None of that is stuff that we would say we caused. We try to recognize we're an actor in a system and worry less about causation and more about, if we're doing some of this work, we'll often have a third party call anonymously, 15 or 20 actors in the space and ask them, who are you and who's influencing you? How are you thinking about this? Those kinds of things. And measuring how often we come up as somebody people are watching, learning from, that kind of thing. And that's kind of as much as we get to attribution to know we're a positive actor on how it's moving.
Well, I think our audience here would appreciate an answer to measurement focusing on learning rather than control or supervision or surveillance.
The problems are too big for us not to learn. Nobody has an answer, a singular answer, or rarely.
So how are your competitors? It sounds like this is very collaborative. You're trying to elevate the whole ecosystem of sustainable sourcing and preserving the environment. But you're also a fierce competitor. How,
Sure.
So how do you square the competition with trying to also inform your competitors to also follow your lead?
That is a place where long-term capitalism helps. Because you actually believe we all have to act that way for it to work. You don't want kind of a failure of the commons. And so I spend a lot of time with our competitors. Many of them are, I have an incredible privilege that I have the support to invest this way and that the company believes in it. Many of them have different constraints. But often real interests, they do get to partner in certain ways. Particularly in sustainability, there tends to be good industry partnerships. But it's hard, and often you're able to have deeper partnerships with adjacencies or suppliers. So for instance, in our work on supply chain, we had a project called Project Gigaton, through which all our suppliers report the sustainability actions they're taking on a number of metrics. That's how we're able to make changes, because it's now a part of our purchase order that you need to report to us how it was sourced in certain ways. And by doing that, we've been doing it for close to a decade now. We change our suppliers' practices so that, you know, in our long-term planning, when General Mills meets with our team, they're going to be asked about their sustainability plans and how they're working on row crops in the Midwest to make them more sustainable. When your biggest purchaser asks that question, suddenly it's a C-suite issue. And so those are the kinds of tools we think about. And then we partner to learn with them. General Mills is a great example of somebody we feel invested with, particularly on sustainable farming in the Midwest. You know, they are able, sometimes I'm investing philanthropically because it's not going to be in our supply chain, and they're investing in their direct farmers. You know, like the money comes different ways, and we were talking about entities. Sometimes it's a direct business investment. Like we don't get caught up in where the money comes from. We make sure we're following all the laws. But we're thrilled if somebody wants to invest out of their P&L.
Will you give us a flavor? I was going to turn to local communities and the importance of local communities to get a feel for impact and how you know, we all want communities to participate more in the philanthropy that is taking place. And you mentioned the kind of anonymous sense of who's moving, influencing, but give us a flavor of, you know, how these kind of, you know, ambitiously systematic, almost global initiatives, how they filter down into kind of local communities, how are they engaged in?
Sure. So we also really believe that communities are better when we have a local philanthropic system, that people are giving back, people are engaged civically, all of these things. And we've been thinking about what our role here can be. We built a platform on Walmart.com called Spark Good.
Spark Good?
Mm-hmm. We have about 50,000 nonprofits and civic organizations on the platform at this point. And those organizations, our stores and clubs make local grants to them. They can apply to the store club for a local grant. They can request the space in front of the store. So when you walk in the store, that little pad to the right side, you can learn to sell their Girl Scout cookies through that. You know, those red kettles that the Salvation Army rings. If anybody wants to make a guess of how much they raised in front of Walmart stores last year, $35 million.
Just Walmart? Wow.
Just Walmart stores, the red kettles in front of stores. So like any nonprofit can register to use that kind of space through the Spark Good platform. If you're on the platform and you've signed up, customers can round up their purchase to you at checkout. So like, we know, we would certainly sometimes do say, we're rounding it to Feeding America, but like, if you say yes, but the Peace at Home Family Shelter is my favorite nonprofit. If they're registered, you can round up to Peace at Home and we'll fund them. And so we believe that people in community want to do good and want to help locally. It's harder than we want it to be. Those of us who work in this area professionally kind of know how to navigate it, but like, if you're a mom with a kid who's 9 and you suddenly have a Saturday morning and you want to go volunteer, it's kind of hard to figure out where you can go. We want to solve those kinds of problems so that people show up for their community. Like, there's less gap between intention and reality of how we live. And we think if we can make it easier, we can do that. We also think we can make it part of, like, you're just shopping. You know, there are a ton of amazing nonprofits who do this too. Their biggest issue is, how do I get traffic here? I have a traffic. How do I like help them do good? Because we already have, you know, over 100 million people coming to the site. So if we can help them do good in their visit, we are hopeful about that. And that's a place where, like, if you have ideas of what we should do with Spark Good, let me know. It's a tech roadmap. We're constantly building and thinking about how we use our local resources to help people do that.
Well, some of our faculty will know better than me, but I think you have more people registered in Spark Good than some of the national clearinghouses for like vetting nonprofits. So.
And in fairness, it's a little bit broader definition. So we fund churches, and this have got to be serving the community, but we do fund a church soup kitchen. We fund local police departments. You know, like it's a broader definition than just kind of the nearest 501c3.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure there's all kinds of research opportunities there too, if you're willing to share some of that data. But that's fascinating. So let's turn to kind of, I'm sure nobody's looking at the headlines today, but we're living a pretty turbulent time.
Yes.
Hopefully you can think with us a little bit more broadly than what's happening. But you've talked a lot to us about sustainability, and racial justice is also a priority for Walmart, and neither of those issues are being leaned into by the current administration. So how are you navigating that issue right now?
One of the greatest assets of Walmart, but also one of the greatest challenges is, you know, let's just limit this to the domestic world context. Like, I could talk about India, I could talk about Mexico, where we have large business in a lot of places, but just in the domestic context, greatest privilege, greatest challenge is we serve America. 90% of Americans live within 10 miles of a Walmart. The demographics we serve reflect the demographics of the US, like pretty much any way you cut it. By race, by age, by income level, they're very, very reflective of the US. So that means we need to take seriously that we serve everyone and have a deep respect for that. And so we do think a lot about this, and you know, some of the things we think about is how we frame and talk about the issues, what our approach is. But there's a 3-part test that I find incredibly helpful. The first is, are we working on an issue that is relevant to Walmart's business? And that we can really deeply articulate the relevance. And that keeps you out of a lot of politics. You know, if you can articulate, like, this is deeply relevant to who we are, because we're going to have we have one of the most diverse employee bases, and we need to have equitable advancement in the world, or whatever it is. Like, being able to start with that gets us out of a lot of things, but also gets us out of the politics of it. Because, like, we want to sell shrimp in 50 years. We got to take care of the oceans differently than we do today if we want to sell shrimp in 50 years. That doesn't sound political when you frame it that way. So that's the first piece, is like being able to understand the issue in a way that is deeply relevant to the business. The second is, we want to work on these issues in ways that build trust. So we're not going to be the point of the spear on articulating this in divisive ways. We're going to look to articulate it in ways like I just did with shrimp. We're going to be very clear we're gonna work with partners who look to build trust and aren't dismissive of half the country. We're gonna, that doesn't mean they have to agree with everyone. Absolutely, that's not what, we're not asking you to do that, but we are asking you to not be, to really have deep respect for people who disagree with you, and to do this in thoughtful ways and approach things in thoughtful ways. And the final piece is we wanna be effective. There are issues we can't be effective on, there are things we would say that we aren't the effective messenger for. There are organizations and approaches that aren't as effective as others. But if you kind of stay in that 3-part test, we can work on a lot of topics. And sustainability and equity issues are 2 of them that remain a part. We probably talk about them differently than we did 2 years ago. But that's partially on the effectiveness and trust issue. It's not saying we're deserting it, it's saying we're learning that the framing of the issue actually didn't serve its long-term outcome of what we're trying to do. If we talk about this differently, if we learn differently, what can we be more effective at building large coalitions to work on this long term?
Those are great notes for me, because I think that's a great test in relevance, trust, and effectiveness. So that I think will serve many of us, hopefully, will in this room as we continue to try to navigate this as well. You mentioned, we didn't talk about this before, but you mentioned, how much of the work is done internationally. So what are some interesting comparisons that strike you in terms of what's different, in terms of how we might experience community life around our local Walmart compare what you might see in India or Latin America or somewhere else?
So in India, we are only online. And so we don't have stores. India has some rules against foreign direct investment, and then we can only be an online retailer. But we're the largest online retailer in India. We own a company called Flipkart and a company called PhonePe, which think of that as the PayPal of India. Digital payment system that actually grew up as part of Flipkart and then is now an independent company. So you're going to experience difference in supply chains. If you're in China, we do have retail in China. We're learning more and more about faster and faster delivery in China. So, our super center kind of box has now got lots of what we call clouds that are these tiny stores that allow us to deliver things much faster. You get things in 2 minutes right now. If it's a frequently ordered item, the speed is just mind-boggling. And super centers now are more fulfillment centers and kind of, I want to go and look at it, touch and feel it before I order it to be delivered to my house kind of thing. My apartment probably is the better way to talk about it in Asia. If you're in Central America, it looks more like a small neighborhood kind of 7-Eleven type store, so that we can be really in local community, very close, and you have more frequent shopping patterns because people go every day for fresh bread or those kinds of things. So it's a really different format around the world. It's not always called Walmart. And it does change how we show up. I mean, the local work looks a little bit different, but there are the same principles around the world. Structurally, because I'm among philanthropy nerds, we have an independent foundation in Mexico. So I'm on the board of the and they do about half the giving and I do about half the giving. So the idea is about half the giving comes from the local market P&L and they do local pieces. And then our team partners with them and chooses a single topic that the business and the global philanthropy are going to work together on to try to change the system on for the 3 to 5 year periods.
So as a student of philanthropy, when we first encounter people or people are just learning about philanthropy, they'll make kind of very general statements about how Americans are just the most generous people in the world. And then other people will say, oh, philanthropy is universal. It's actually something that happens in every community. What do you see in terms of what you've been learning kind of about philanthropy across borders over these years?
I mean, I think it is different. I don't know that I'd say generosity is different. I think it just, the structure of it looks different. Some of this is neighbors helping neighbors and kind of more of a, we have each other's backs mentality that I think, like I was a student of Bob Payton, voluntary action for the public good is the definition of philanthropy. It's not like a structured thing. And so that is, I don't think all that different. This kind of idea of I give money and somebody else figures out, like that does feel more uniquely valuable. One of the more interesting trips I was able to take in this job was after the tsunami in Japan. We don't own retail in Japan anymore, but the Japanese government had asked us to send somebody to help them think about how to build a culture of structured philanthropy, because they were learning it plays an important role that they were missing. And so I spent a couple of weeks with them thinking about how might you build a culture and a structure that would support companies and others being part of philanthropic culture. It's really hard if it's not natural. I didn't have answers. It's a great trip, but I'm not sure I had advice.
But wherever Walmart shows up, however it shows up, it's trying to participate in these larger social solutions in some useful way.
Yeah,
So,
and we're giving in every market.
so you've met some of our students. We have students and aspiring philanthropy leaders here, and as you know, people who want to make a difference with their work and their passions in the world often struggle to figure out, how to craft that in a way that's actually moving the world in a particular direction. So, how based on your own career, how would you advise folks in terms of how do you figure out what it is you actually do to realize that passion and that interest you have in making a difference?
I would love to tell you I have the answer to that. I mean, I'm still on that journey myself. I think it is thinking really deeply about what you're trying to achieve and what role you want to play. I mean, Jen and I were talking about this. Like, I am not somebody who gets hung up on the 17 different models of philanthropy and which one's better than the other kind of person. I believe you need to use the right kind of philanthropy to have the right kind of change that you're envisioning, and it all, like, the logic needs to flow through. But I do think this moment is really interesting. And I want to go back to something you said about this moment. I'm spending a lot of time, I'm sure all of you are too, with leaders trying to make a sense of like what's going on and what I do. When I don't have practical advice, but I spent a little bit of time recently with Henry Timms, who wrote New Power, and many may have followed some. He was at the 92nd Street Y. He's done a lot of nonprofit work.
He's been busy.
Yeah, and he created Giving Tuesday. And he was talking about, he was reflecting on this moment. He was asked to help a bunch of Walmart leaders think about like what's going on in this moment. And he said, many of us have worked and lived our lives in institutions, and I certainly count myself as one of them, and we like still subscribe to institutions. But if we kind of look over the last decade, this has been a series of people unsubscribing from lots of things. Unsubscribing from science, unsubscribing from vaccines, unsubscribing from religious institutions. It's not all kind of, and those of us who lead institutions are not necessarily grappling with we're just like saying, buy me, resubscribe, like trust me. We have not grappled with like, how are we not serving the people who are unsubscribing? How are we not building trust in the ways we need to? And like, look, I'm a big believer in institutions. I'm part of a huge one. I think they play a really important role. But I do think it needs to be a moment where we're reflecting on our institutions serving what they want, what they say they are solving. And what do we need to do to rebuild trust? And our structures needed to change. How are we listening more differently? How are we not dismissing things? Like, there's a lot to be done, and I don't have those answers. But I do think it's an important time for those of us at institutions to be not necessarily defending how our institution works today, defending the role of institutions, but potentially reinventing institutions in a way that builds more trust and has more effectiveness.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And hopefully, there's something that universities can do, because we're supposed to help train people like you who are great interpreters of what's happening in the world.
Listen well.
But part of interpreting well, it has to do with listening well, and being curious and reading widely and being curious about what others think as well. So I think that's, at this moment, there's a kind of discontinuity where we're interpreting things based on fundamental values. What we had hoped institutions would be doing, but came up short, is really important. So, to try to use the fact that we are in this really unusual moment that none of us are old enough to, I think, not even me, remember a time that was quite as disruptive as this one. Like kind of more practical advice for students who are looking to kind of march up some kind of a ladder, even though the ladder may be changing, it might be a rope or whatever, in the future. Kind of what's worked for you in terms of making those career changes, career moves, investments in yourself that you'd like to leave our students with?
I was probably the least likely fellow at the time that I was a fellow to do this work. Many of my colleagues worked at like the foundations locally and that kind of stuff. I worked at the Homeless Day Center, Horizon House, and was like, structured formal philanthropy is horrible and problem. And like, I definitely came from that more kind of side of thinking. I think the journey piece is important. I became really obsessed with learning and building skills. I thought I'd lead a small nonprofit, and I recognized as a small nonprofit leader kind of has to know a lot about a lot of things. And so I became obsessed with taking jobs that would build the next skill and give me more experience with working with the board, with evaluation, with ended up at Walmart somewhat for that. Thought, wait, I'll spend a couple of years here, I'll learn from some about PR and comms people, I'll sit at the feet of financial people and they'll teach me P&Ls and that kind of stuff. And so like, I'm a big believer that you just take a step and you learn and those kinds of things. There are 3 things I hire against, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier. I hire for people who are deeply experienced. Walmart is a massive place to learn. There are so many people who know more than you. If you don't want to learn and use that ecosystem, plus grantees, plus kinds of things like this, like wasting an opportunity. I hire people who listen well, and have the humility to combine what they know with other people's knowledge and build. And then I think there's a piece that's really essential to come on top of that, which is people who connect dots well. So great, you've got a lot of curiosity, you've listened well, but you got to be able to put it together and connect things and build hypotheses and test them with others, and kind of particularly if you're trying to change a system. Because systems are interconnected, you need to be able to like have a big picture view and then go down to the micro and like back and forth and kind of put all of that together to understand what might need to change.
Yeah, that kind of nice articulates some of my instincts. I'm biased to want to ask you more questions, so you give me great answers. But why don't we turn it to the audience? You have some time. We have some time to ask some questions of our guests. Sir, in the back.
How big of a team do you need to run all that?
I have a team of 30 people. We are tiny for for $2 billion of cash and kind and $100 million raised. It means I ask a lot of favors of the company.
Okay, so you rely on the infrastructure, what the company brings to your team to do all that stuff. And I suppose you travel a lot as well, so interesting. Thank you.
You don't have your own plane, right?
No. Coach commercial.
Yeah, you expect.
I mean, I would say it means there are advantages to that. Like you have to look for the upside. That EDLP, it means we're going to be a lean team. The upside is you can't have a lot of bureaucracy. Foundations can have a lot of bureaucracy if they aren't careful. People make big decisions. We move pretty fast. I think our grantees say like, we don't ask questions we don't need to ask. Like we practice a lot of trust-based practices because we can't meet with you monthly.
Let's create a nice sense of energy on the team too. There's not too much process, right? That's cool.
But finding how you do that while still getting compliance and all those things is, I think most leaders are trying to balance all that.
So could you explain where publicly facing information is? Because my understanding is Walmart walked back a lot of its.
Yeah,
I
the
saw-
DEI work.
Yes, and I actually unsubscribed from Walmart as a customer just because of all the state. So I'm surprised to hear that equity is still a focus because a lot of the front facing.
Yeah.
So
there were changes. So I don't want to pretend that there weren't. I don't think the the narrative changed, so, we had an activist who has come after a bunch of companies, come after us, his name's Ravi Starbuck, he comes after companies and often shows things the company doesn't actually know what's going on, that like are probably further than you would go. And we made a series of commitments with him that included some of the change of language, things like shifting our language around Latinx, which actually our own internal associates have been talking about, they didn't identify with that title, you know, and so there were a number of things that did change. There were also a number of changes the company had made. So for instance, we had been looking at the efficacy of our supplier diversity program. Well, what we were finding is actually what was needed is work with small suppliers. The issues were mainly of a certain size working with us, and we needed to be much better at that, and we would actually be better at all supplier diversity. And we could get some leverage. So we had shifted to a supplier program that was about small suppliers. It will continue to include many, many diverse suppliers, and we will continue to track our spending with diverse suppliers. But that change had already been made. And so, you know, a media narrative becomes hard to counter in these moments. And so what I would say is I feel like there's still really meaningful work that is relevant to the company that goes on. Do we talk about it differently? Did we commit to some things? Absolutely. Thanks for asking.
Is there a question? So what about, you know, one is a good question. What about your employees? How are they, how are they navigating the changes in narrative?
So there's some really interesting work I'm gonna get, like, I'll get to your question. And I think it's all overall, because it is a purpose-driven company, people kind of identify there and then recognize the diversity of the staff. One of the things we've been funding just a little bit in is a portfolio that we call Caring and Connected Communities. And it is a little bit of how might you go pre-polarization, how might we reduce polarization? It's got a lot of things fundamentally that also ties to resilience of a community. When you have deep relationships across lines of difference in the local community, you're more resilient to disaster, you're more resilient to all kinds of shock. And so we funded some research by a group called More in Common. Many of you may know them. They're the exhausted majority, like there are a number of phrases that are now popular to describe like the state of polarization in the US that come from their research. They show 80% of people want to have meaningful relationships across lines of difference, 80% of Americans. The reason they don't is they don't feel like they have the opportunity to do that. And that's not normative in their community because they don't see role modeling and kind of narratives that do that. And the two places they want to do that are the workplace and solving a local community problem. And I think we see that in Walmart all the time, which is we have a really diverse workforce. They come together to solve problems all the time. And that leads to a different conversation when you actually have a meaningful relationships across lines of difference. You know, things aren't quite the same when you're talking about politics because you actually have humanized the person and believe that they are inherently worthwhile versus just a caricature of, and so we're thinking more and more about how we create that as normative, what it would take to create a society where it's normative to have lots of deep, meaningful relationships across lines of difference. We think volunteerism is a big part of that.
That sounds like an exciting endeavor that some of us in universities could hopefully participate in that in some useful way as well. Roberta.
Hi, Julie, it's so great for you to be here. Could you just press a little further into that? Because you're talking about sort of the dynamic nature of things. And I think social media is so one-dimensional. And this is where this stuff kind of gets propagated. So how do you sort of like jive those things together?
Yeah, so we have a tiny investment in potential alternatives to social media models today. I'm personally a little bit more skeptical of that. I'll give an example of a grantee that I think is really interesting. So we fund an organization called Team Up. which is a coalition of the Interfaith Alliance, YMCA, Catholic Charities, and Habitat for Humanity. So these are all large nonprofits with lots of locations. Interfaith Alliance a little bit different, but and they are building the skills of their frontline employees so that a habitat build, instead of just being with the church, is potentially the church and the synagogue together building a house. And it's not to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. It's to build the house and talk about the park down the street and like, you know, really just actually build relationships and trust locally. And part of the hypothesis is intergroup contact theory, is kind of academic work of like, when we know each other and we humanize each other, we actually can work our way up to the harder things. But we'll recognize our common humanity because we started by building that house, and I learned your kid goes to the same school mine does, and we both are worried that that park doesn't feel as safe as it was a couple of years ago, and you know, like that kind of base stuff needs to be reinvigorated. And so I'm really hopeful that some of our large civic organizations like Habitat and others, if we build this as a competency of leaders of nonprofits, frontline nonprofit workers, to be relationship builders, like that could be meaningful.
Well, I've certainly learned a lot and been inspired. Michael, I have a question.
I hope this is not too vague, but you know, one of the things that, as you well know, we talk a lot about with corporate philanthropy is what we always just call enlightened self-interest, right? Where and you talk about it as shared value, people use blended value, these other things where there's always going to be you are pursuing, and you talked about it a little bit with your relevance criteria. Is it relevant for the business? That there's always going to be some element of self-interest for the company.
Yep.
Whether that is the, you know, marketing and branding, positive, sense of the company that people have because they know you do your philanthropic work, or you're investing in local communities, building the quality of life so that you have more, productive workers and all the other things that could be positive. But there's also still some charitable and philanthropic interest and public good interest that you're doing, and you live in that middle ground. And I'm just wondering, are there moments when and how do you judge these, when it leans too much one way or the other? So are there things that you end up doing where you realize, well, that's not really gonna do a whole lot for the business, but we know it's great philanthropically, or that's really great for the business, but I'm not really sure it's ever gonna really have a big impact philanthropically, but it's gonna make us look great. How do you manage that, like living in that balance, that sort of seesaw, if you will, because you live in a blended interest world?
I do, and like, so the first piece is, I think I have come to think philosophically about like, if I can make the market work, that shrinks what I have to solve philanthropically. And so that's the first kind of philosophical piece, is like, we do not have enough, philanthropy is a limited resource, even if we grow it. Just by design, it is. Also, the problems that philanthropy needs to solve outstrip its capacity today. And so the more I can get as many problems as possible served by the market, the better. And markets working in a way that is in kind of this triple bottom line interest, whatever you want to call it. So that's the first piece that I like believe that helps here, because then it's like, yeah, I do want companies to have enlightened self-interest, and like, it's not bad for them to act in that way. And this purity thing piece becomes a little bit of a less concern, because you're like, no, that's good for everybody. Then there's like the balls and strikes of individual investments, which I think is some of this. So because I'm able to use philanthropy and business, the things that don't have a strong business lever, I don't think they're bad philanthropic projects. I just don't think they're right for Walmart's philanthropy. So an example is K-12 education. It needs philanthropic investment. We have no leverage. You don't want Walmart solving your K-12 education. Like, that's not our core competency.
The Walton family does that.
The Walton family does, that's their choice, those kinds of things, but like, that would be kind of an opportunity cost to the philanthropic, because I have no expertise that an individual donor wouldn't have. No levers to pull that are unique. So that's going to end up on the probably not us side of this. Not necessarily because it's not relevant to the business. We probably would get a lot of credit for that. but we just aren't positioned for maximum impact. On the other side of that's too close to business, that is hard. Because very candidly, there's a gap between what philanthropy will fund and market will invest in. Or philanthropy legally should fund a number of things. And I haven't figured that out yet. You know, often philanthropy will have done really good early stage investment, built some capacity research. It's not yet, you know, let's go back to the kind of place-based projects for nature. Philanthropy will have built the capacity. They aren't yet ready for a purchase order from a company, but it's also now not philanthropic. And what kind of capital plays in that kind of gap, I think is something, it's part of why we're seeing emerging structures of LLCs and other things that, you know, will blend before in that it actually isn't the hardest to solve problem that philanthropy should play a role in, but also markets aren't going to invest in it yet. And there's more work to be done.
Well, that's a great last question. We want to respect your time, but also give you the last word. If there's anything else you'd like to share with us based on your wonderful answers and your reflections before you tell us, go either on your Jane Addams experience, or you can tell us what you read to keep perspective on the world, or any other concluding thoughts.
I'll take all the answers on that one, but anybody. I would just say thank you. I think that I am incredibly grateful for the experience of the fellowship. I feel like it did, you know, there's a story that I always have to tell of Mr. Payton. So for those who don't know, the fellowship, at the time I was there, was assigned reading that was just like the beast. You know, reading the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times every day, along with the classics, along with, you know, like it was 1,000 pages plus of reading on a regular basis. And then showing up in Mr. Payton's basement for 4 hours and just pressing go on, like, he's gonna go wherever he wants in the reading from that, and you better be ready. And then follow-ups individually with Mr. Payton, that at the time I was there, were at Barnes and Noble. And he would show up before the fellow would, and you'd meet him in the coffee section and he'd have a pile of books there that he would have pulled. And he would have purchased them and be giving them to you. And he would say, Julie, you don't need to read these now, but this is the, like, I heard what you said in seminar last time. This is the better case for what you're trying to argue. This is the person who is the best, like, alternate view, because you're actually wrong and they're smarter and you need and like, but that kind of like grappling with the smartest minds, asking tough questions, being like constantly learning and putting it together and challenged, I think is a really important thing, and how the school can continue to do that so that those of us who have these privileged jobs to try to make the world a better place are doing it as responsibly and thoughtfully as possible is incredibly important. So thank you for what you do.
Well, that's a wonderful way to conclude, and thank you for being with us and sharing all these thoughts. Please join me.